Okay, so now let's review a few points that may help you avert communication breakdown with your autistic spouse. So when your autistic husband looks away during a conversation, see it for what it is, and that's this. He's reducing visual stimulus to be able to better process what is being heard or to more clearly determine what he wants to say. So just keep in mind that shifty eyes do not necessarily mean he's not listening. Okay, so next point. Your autistic husband may listen to each word that you speak and interpret your meaning based on his understanding of the definition of the words you use. You, as the neurotypical wife, are no doubt able to generalize quite a bit better when someone says something like, "Oh, put a pile of mashed potatoes on my plate, I'm starving." Okay, you would know approximately what that means. You say something vague like that to your autistic husband, you're probably going to get a blank look. So when the message is in words, it pays to be as specific as possible. Be concrete, keep it short, don't be vague, don't speak in terms of analogies or metaphors or sarcasm. So if you will be as specific as possible, that's going to really help. This is going to save time in the long run, preventing repeat requests or lengthy explanations when a more precise word or phrase is all that is really needed for your husband to get your meaning. Next point. The more comfortable your husband is, the more likely he is to be relaxed in conversation and easier to communicate with, understand, and be understanding. Trust him when he demonstrates a wish to do something relaxing in the face of an important issue. Reduction of stress can be crucial in important situations and should not be considered a lack of understanding about the urgency of the situation. Decrease the stressors, however small they may appear to you, and you will decrease behaviors that you have found confusing and frustrating. Next point, and I'm sure you already know this. People on the autism spectrum don't respond well to criticism, even constructive criticism. They view constructive criticism and even some neutral comments as threats or manipulation. So even if you don't think that you're being critical, if your interaction is perceived this way, even falsely, you are going to get a defensive response. Next point, consider your verbal versus nonverbal communication. It's highly likely that your husband on the autism spectrum relies more heavily on your words and less on body language, or he may rely more on body language and less on your words, which may result in a higher frequency of misinterpretation on his part. So, you want to find out which method he uses predominantly. Is he paying more attention to your words, or your body language, or your voice inflection? So how do you determine this? You're going to do a little bit of an investigation. If you find that he is frequently misunderstanding you without stopping to consider that he is completely off base, he may be misinterpreting your body language and otherwise nonverbal messages. For example, expressions, tone of voice, conversational pauses, etc. On the other hand, if he repeatedly asks questions about what you are saying, then you'll know that he is relying more heavily on your word usage. And if you get the impression that he's listening, and after the fact you realize he didn't listen or understand anything you said, then it's a safe bet that he was paying more attention to your voice inflection, especially if your voice inflection was conveying anger or frustration, in which case he basically short-circuited and was just looking at your mouth without retaining anything in his memory bank. Next point, accept that you don't experience life the same way as your husband does. His obstacles, interests, complaints, and frustrations are likely to seem illogical to you, but there are many issues that contribute to the way he views the world. Communication issues, stigma, sensory sensitivities, stereotypical interest, unique responses to social issues and other stressors, and many, many, many more things that you may be unable to imagine. If you look at it as if he is dodging paintballs all day, every day, paintballs that are invisible to you, it may make a little more sense that he moves the way he does, talks the way he does, and makes the decisions he does.
So what's going on here, guys, is, and this sounds a little accusatory, but it's not meant to be, because of some of the social and emotional challenges that you haven't met a lot of her expectations or her desire for the emotional reciprocity to the degree that she wants. And it's a little bit like a cancer has developed in the relationship. So if you had cancer or you know somebody who has cancer, there's a long recovery. There's surgery to remove the tumor. There could be radiation, chemotherapy, all of these different things. And it could be 6 months or a year or more before you're clean, before you go back to the doc and said, yeah, we can't find one cancer cell in your body. for now you're good to go. You beat it. You're done. That's a long-ass process. All of you all in here are right in the middle of that process, and you're just now beginning treatment. So when you feel like it, well, doesn't matter what I'm doing, it's never good enough. Doesn't matter what I say, I'm always wrong. I'm using these strategies that I learned, and it doesn't feel like things are getting better. You got to realize that this is a long haul deal here. So don't lose your confidence. If you're doing the strategies that we're talking about, you should notice some improvement immediately. But to get it to the level where you want it, where she's no longer agitated and giving you a bunch of grief, that's going to take a long time. Passivity is, I'm afraid that I'm going to say or do something wrong, so I'm going to try to say and do as little as possible. Anything to keep the peace. We don't want to work that way anymore. Aggressiveness would be, she's upset with me, she's nagging me, this makes me very anxious, and now my anxiety is coming out as anger and rage. We don't want that anymore. So we're trying to get into the middle, and that's going to be assertiveness. What she wants more than anything from you is to be empathic, but empathy is incompatible with shutdowns and or meltdowns. Let me repeat this. She's wanting empathy from you, and you're not going to be able to deliver if you're jumping back and forth between passivity and aggressive. So you have to be assertive before you can practice empathy.
So one thing that comes up a lot from the NT wife is she thinks her husband has pathological demand avoidance, or PDA. Well, first of all, PDA is not recognized as a disorder. It's not in the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. And secondarily, even though it looks like he's ignoring or avoiding anything that he perceives as a demand, what's really going on is that when the NT wife demands something and he seems to ignore it or avoid doing it, it's not that he just doesn't give a shit and says, screw you, I'm not interested in meeting your needs. He's not purposely trying to be oppositional or defiant. What's going on here is these, quote, demands, unquote, fall way outside of his special interest, or he doesn't view it as something that even needs to be done at all. So does it look like he's ignoring or avoiding anything that he perceives as a demand? Yes, it looks like that. But the motive here is not to be purposefully oppositional or defiant or disrespectful or uncaring, selfish, narcissistic, and so on. Another reason for lack of follow-through is often his anxiety. And so if you are requesting or demanding his participation in something that's going to raise his anxiety, then he's likely to want to avoid that. And that's often manifested in the form of a shutdown. But here again, the motive is not to be dismissive or to reject you or to be insensitive to your needs. The motive is, in this case, to remove himself from the source of anxiety and decompress. And so if you want your autistic spouse to start paying attention to your demands or requests, and you want him to start following through, then you need to get his buy-in up front. You need to appeal to his logic, and you need to come up with the facts that support why it's a good idea to follow through with this thing that you want him to follow through with. So in all discussions with your ASD spouse about a particular situation, there will be two aspects. One, the selling of an idea, which is your part, and two, the buying of the idea, which is your spouse's part. Both parts must always be considered together. The best sales pitch is incomplete if the new idea is not accepted or bought. This process requires constant monitoring of progress by the salesperson, which is you, who should look and ask for feedback from the buyer, which is your ASD spouse, regarding this step-by-step approach. A cardinal rule is to never move ahead to the next step without checking to see if the buyer is moving with you. If he's not, repeat the previous step in another way. For your ASD spouse, this means that you need to convince him that there's a better way to look at it and react to a situation than what he has shown you. He needs to hear what you're saying, maybe even see it, and then accept it if you want his cooperation. But you must realize that new thinking can't occur easily because your ASD spouse is not a blank slate. He already has a competitive version of your idea. Different stories and interpretations are present in him that will compete with your new story or mindset. So if the new mindset or thinking is to succeed, it must replace, suppress, complement, or outweigh every other story or competing version or idea. Only the most powerful argument will win out. Now, your prior history with your ASD spouse is a very powerful force in this equation. All previous unproductive discussions and interventions that you've had with him will make your job that much harder, and these unproductive discussions must be replaced. To deal with these factors, you must be persistent, stick to the point, not allow irrelevant items to be brought into the conversation, and finally, you need to provide reasons and facts for the new thinking. Okay, so now we want to look at the 9 traits that may be associated with either sensory-seeking behaviors or sensory avoidance. in your ASD spouse. So the first one we'll call sensory limit. This is related to how sensitive your ASD spouse is to physical stimuli, for example, sounds, taste, touch, temperature changes, and so on. And it also refers to the amount of stimulation needed to elicit a response, positive or negative, in your spouse. For example, is he a picky eater, or will he eat almost anything? Does he startle easily to sounds? Does he respond positively or negatively to the feeling of clothing? Does he react positively or negatively to particular sounds? Okay, the second trait of sensory-seeking behaviors or sensory avoidance would be predictability. This trait refers to the regularity of biological functions such as appetite and sleep. For example, does he get hungry or tired at predictable times, or is he unpredictable in terms of hunger and tiredness? The third trait we're going to call perseverance. This is the length of time your ASD spouse persists in activities in the face of difficulty. For example, does she react strongly when interrupted in an activity? Does she persist in an activity when you wanted to interrupt her and talk about something? Number 4, disposition. This is the tendency to react to things primarily in either positive or negative ways. For example, is your ASD spouse generally serious? Is he generally in a happy mood, or does he tend to focus on the negative aspects of life? Does he tend to see the glasses half full or half empty? Does he focus on positive aspects of life? So we call that disposition. Number 5, emotional energy level. This is the intensity of a response, whether positive or negative. For example, does your spouse get upset in a very strong and dramatic way, or does he just get quiet when he's upset? Does he react strongly and loudly to everything, even relatively minor events, or do most things seem to just roll off of his back? Number 6, physical energy level. Now this refers to how active your spouse is in general. For example, is he always on the go, or does he prefer sedentary, quiet activities? Does he have difficulty sitting still? Does he tend to wiggle, squirm, or pace? Next, let's look at attention level. This is the degree of concentration and paying attention that's exhibited when your spouse is not particularly interested in an activity. This trait refers to the ease with which external stimuli hampers the ongoing behavior. For example, does she become sidetracked easily when attempting to follow routine or working on some activity? Is she easily distracted by sounds or sights? Is she easily soothed when upset by engaging in some self-soothing behavior? And number 8 is approach withdrawal. This refers to the person's typical response to strangers or a new situation. For example, does your ASD spouse eagerly approach new situations or new people, or does he seem hesitant and resistant when faced with new situations, people, or things? So that's the approach withdrawal trait. Number 9 is flexibility. This is related to how easily your ASD spouse adapts to changes and transitions. In other words, switching to a new activity. For example, does she take a long time to become comfortable in new situations? Does she have difficulty with changes in routines or with transitions from one activity to another? So those are the 9 traits of sensory-seeking behaviors or sensory avoidance. We have sensory limit, predictability, perseverance, disposition, emotional energy level, physical energy level, attention level, approach withdrawal, and flexibility. So just bear in mind that sensory processing difficulties in people on the autism spectrum have a huge impact on your relationship with your ASD spouse. A person on the spectrum who is experiencing these difficulties will react to you and his environment in ways that are unpredictable and kind of irrational. For example, if your ASD spouse is overly sensitive to sound, then he can react negatively to your voice inflection or the volume of your voice. And so as a result, you may be confused by his reaction, which may result in you feeling that he doesn't want to listen or has no interest in your good message.
She is high in social emotional intelligence, you not so much. You're high in logic. So she is high in social and emotional needs, you not so much. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. She's just doing the way she's wired, you're doing the way you don't require a whole lot of talk or discussion or exploration about feelings. You're probably not a super social person unless it's work related. So we have this dilemma because you can imagine, because you are more task oriented, more involved with facts, figures, objects, task completion, whereas she is more of a people person. So you can see why we have this problem. That doesn't mean anybody did anything wrong. but it does cause a problem in the relationship. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. So one of the main things that we're trying to accomplish is to, in my book, is to reduce your relationship stress. You, the guys, I'm going to reduce your relationship stress. How can I do that? Open up the channels of communication, because if she were here, she would say the number one problem is he doesn't provide emotional reciprocity, and we can't talk about things, especially the difficult stuff. He has a meltdown or a shutdown or some variation thereof, and we can never solve the problems. And so the problems pile up, pile up, pile up. They're in the closet this whole time, and they're not going anywhere. They're still in there breathing and growing. In other words, they get worse as time goes on. So if you have something that's 3 years old and then she brings it up again, it's going to be a lot worse than if you'd have dealt with it 3 years ago. Her main complaint might also be he doesn't listen. So sometimes he, and I'm just speaking in generalities here, he is listening, or he's pretending like he's listening, but he's not fully hearing everything. And we use the percentage of maybe he only heard 80% of the 80% he heard, maybe didn't quite understand all of that, and was afraid to ask for clarification, for fear he'd get his head bit off. So now he's down to 70% of comprehension. And then of the 70% that he understood, he only retained 50% of it. This could be because she provided too much data. You had brain overload and maybe were anxious as she was throwing words at you, and so you didn't retain some of these things. And then of the portion that you did retain, for whatever reason, maybe you didn't implement because maybe you just weren't quite sure what you were supposed to do or supposed to say. Most often, your version of meltdown or shutdown is a result of heightened anxiety. She can and has been abrasive in her approach. She had a good message, but her delivery, it wasn't tailored to a neurodiverse communication style. If she doesn't get this piece, that she's going to have to keep it short and simple and concrete and non-accusatory, then she's going to have to just continue to do it her way, which you then will continue to have anxiety over her message delivery, and the whole thing will just short circuit.
Hey guys, this is Mark Hutten with AdultAsperger'sChat.com, and today I want to talk about the legitimate reasons for NT plus ASD conflict. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at the legitimate reasons for conflict between the neurotypical wife and the husband on the autism spectrum. So why does conflict exist so profoundly between the two of you? Probably worse than in a typical marriage. Well, the two of you get defensive when talking to one another because there is an emotional link between the two of you. Think about it like this. When you don't care about someone, for example, Joe Blow, let's say he's a coworker and he's annoying and you don't even like to be in the same room with him, it doesn't matter much what that person says or does. You could care less. You could never see the guy again and you wouldn't care. But when you love and care for someone, and when you want that person to love and respect you back, it hurts when they do unloving, uncaring things. And that hurt most often comes out as anger. How many times have you thought to yourself, I'm talking to the ASD men now, my neurotypical wife is such a nag. ASD men hate when their NT wife nags, and they try to get her to stop nagging by getting angry in order to create distance. But nagging equals importance. She nags because you're important and because she doesn't want you to destroy the relationship. Unfortunately, a lot of AS men don't know this, or they don't view it like this, and they view her nagging as criticism and harassment. So as a result, the NT wife's good message gets lost. Now, when your ASD husband seems insensitive, selfish, uncaring, narcissistic, and so on, it's because he's in too much emotional pain to be able to consider your message. Your message is anxiety-ridden, according to his brain. And pain interferes with listening and with understanding where you're coming from. Now, this is particularly hard to understand when he hides his pain with rage, adult temper tantrums, shutdowns, meltdowns, the silent treatment, always making you wrong, and so on. And with him responding like this, it's not uncommon for the NT wife to, in turn, direct her anger and rage back at him. Now, here's another odd concept, but it's the truth, and that is sometimes spouses behave in manipulative, hurtful ways, not because they think that they're going to change the other person's behavior necessarily, but because they honestly feel that they're doing the best that they can given the circumstances. Both spouses feel that way. The NT wife thinks, well, you know, I didn't sign up for this program where I have somebody on the autism spectrum. I have to make all these adjustments and accommodations. And he's going, I've tried my best. Doesn't matter what I say or do. It's never good enough. So we're in that dilemma there with both parties feeling like they're victims. Both spouses think they're doing right. If we think our spouse is doing bad things because they have evil intentions, we may give up trying to influence them. We may become afraid of them. We're certainly going to get angry with them, and we might even seek revenge. So it's important to realize that both spouses, the NT and the ASD, they're not bad people. They're just desperate to find a solution to the problems and haven't found one yet, oftentimes to the point of feeling nothing but helpless and hopeless. But you can be sure that both spouses are sharing a common experience of hurt and fear. But they're expressing their emotions in different and sometimes strange ways. For example, your ASD husband may have an intimate relationship with the computer or with his job. You may be depressed, anxious, perhaps trying to anesthetize your emotional pain through emotional eating, and so on. So each party is hurting, but they're expressing their hurt in different ways. So the NT wife does nag and complain, moan and groan. I know that's what the ASD man thinks, but her intentions are good. She's trying to keep the relationship from sinking. But unfortunately, she has thought, well, if I just try harder, if I stop trying, if I'm nicer, if I'm tougher, if I complain, if I stop complaining, if we go to traditional marriage and family counseling, all of these things, she's trying, and none of them work. And she is frustrating him in the meantime. So we have to change the way we approach the problem. And the very first step has to be to take a deep dive in examining how the NT wife downloads certain things and then behaves accordingly, and how the ASD man downloads things and behaves accordingly. But the moral to this story is, guys, she's nagging because she cares about you. Fear is something that you're afraid of, but you know exactly what it is. For example, let's say you hate going to the dentist and you've got to go to the dentist next week, and you know you're going to sit there and get a cavity worked on, and you kind of predict what's going to go on. You already know because you've been there and done it before. So yes, there's some apprehension there, but you know what's going to happen. Anxiety, though, is being afraid of something and you don't know what it is. You just know that you feel anxious, and the anxiety that's going on in the moment is not the event itself, because you don't even know what the event is. It's your self-talk. So we have to look at self-talk. So if the event actually manifests itself in your life, the one that you've been worrying about so much, that actual event will be way less emotionally painful than the worrying about that event prior to the actual occurrence. The actual event is not the source of your anxiety. It's the thinking about the event that is the source of your anxiety. Think of it like this. Let's say you're in college, you've got a big exam coming up, maybe it's the final, and it's super important that you get a good grade on this. And maybe you have some test anxiety, and so you engage in this if-then business. If I freeze up, then I might flunk this test. Or if it's harder than I think, and if I didn't study enough for this test, I may get a bad grade. And if I don't pass this exam, I may flunk the course. And if I flunk the course, I may have to take it again. And if I have to take the course again, then it's going to take longer for me to get my degree. And if it takes longer for me to get my degree, it's going to cost me more money. And if my parents are helping me financially, they may get upset with me for taking longer than expected. And so you get in this if-then loop, a bunch of what-ifs, and that is the anxiety. Another example is there was a lady who had IBS symptoms, and it triggered her anxiety, and so her commute was particularly stressful. So she gets up and she starts having some stomach issues, and then she starts getting sucked into this if-then loop. If I have stomach troubles this morning, then I'm going to have anxiety on the way to work. And if I have anxiety on the way to work, then I'm going to have to stop at a gas station somewhere on an emergency basis. And if I do that, then I'm going to be late for work. And if I'm late for work, then I'm going to get a point. And if I get too many points, I'm going to get fired. And so you're down in this rabbit hole of what ifs. There again, that is the anxiety, not so much the drive to work in and of itself. So you get the point, right? The anxiety is the what-if business. It is the if-then loop that you get sucked into. So what we can do in that case is we can look for triggers to our anxiety and maybe even journal those. It wouldn't necessarily have to be a notebook. It could be one piece of paper. And so after you have an anxiety-provoking event and you're calm, you could write down, okay, what happened right before I got anxious? That is the trigger. And then you would also want to write down what was my self-talk during this anxiety-provoking event. So let's use an example of a husband on the autism spectrum, and his neurotypical wife is upset about something, and so she is asking a lot of questions. You know, maybe she's saying things like, why can't you ever blah, 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 or why do you always do such and such, or what were you thinking when you didn't follow through with blah, blah, blah. And so she's upset, and she's kind of interrogating, and so that is the anxiety-provoking event. And then maybe your self self-talk was, oh my God, here we go again, complain, complain, complain. I'm always in trouble. I didn't do anything wrong. Why is she treating me like a child? I feel so criticized. I have to defend myself. I have to prove that she is wrong, etc. So in this example, her complaints about the relationship not going right did download as a trigger for you, but it was the self-talk that exacerbated the anxiety. So what do we want to do? We want to begin the business of practicing different self-talk. So using the example that I just illustrated where she is upset and she's kind of quizzing you, why can't you do this? Why do you always do that? Because she's frustrated and at her wit's end, and you're downloading that as nothing but criticism and put downs and shaming and blaming. So what could you do differently next time in the way of self-talk? Here's some ideas. I could realize that she's quizzing me because the relationship is really important to her. Another thought could be, I'll stay and listen, and then I'll paraphrase back what I heard so I can understand her point. In other words, I'm going to listen to understand rather than listen to mount a defense. Another thought could be, I'll ask what I can do to help rather than just do some version of shutdown or meltdown. So we want to replace the negative self-talk that sets us up for the if-then loop with more positive, constructive, and realistic inner dialogue that is more representative of what might actually be going on. So in summary, the best anxiety reduction strategy for you will be for you to identify what types of self-talk you engage in when you're in the throes of a particular anxiety-producing event. And each event will trigger different self-talk. You want to look at those, and you want to begin the process of coming up with some deliberate replacements for the negative self-talk. So that's the key term, deliberate. You will have to start thinking deliberately when you're in the middle of the storm. Hey, this is Mark Hutten. Would you like to schedule a one-on-one Zoom call? Okay, it's so simple. Just look under any of my videos in the description area. Click on this Calendly link. Now you see my calendar. Pick your month, your day, anytime that's available. Enter your name and email address. Then you'll get a follow-up email with the Zoom link on the day and time that you picked. And voila, we will talk.